has a happy ever after. And after this story, there's an after party. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Happy Ever After Party. I'm your host, Sam Logston, and this week, you get me all to yourself. Amanda Pierce isn't feeling too terribly well. I myself am not feeling my greatest, and this upcoming episode, the season 2 opening of Once Upon a Time, is an episode so infuriating in certain aspects that I don't think that I can do it by myself. So we'll have that ready for you next week. And in the meantime, I wanted to take certain liberties and talk about one of my favorite poetry books ever made. And that is Tim Burton's The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy and Other Stories. So this is a poetry book that was written and illustrated by Tim Burton, published in 1997. And I remember reading this around the time that it came out. My brother is about 10 years older than me. So he would have been about 16 at the time or so, like 15 or 16. So this book was right up his alley for being a angsty 90s teen, loved black humor, and as a little kid, this was the kind of stuff that I also gravitated towards. And what's really interesting about this particular book is that it does seem to hone in on what makes most nursery rhymes work without it just being like really weird rhyming things about inanimate objects. The main story itself, The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy, I'll get to in a second, but I actually wanted to go through some of my favorites in here. The book actually begins with one of my favorites, and I wish that I could show you these illustrations. I might put a link up to either like Amazon or something else, so if you're interested in buying it, you can. But when I talk about that it really harkens back to nursery rhymes without it being like too excessively random, nursery rhymes have a history for doing a couple of things. They either describe the function of the personified figures in the nursery rhyme, or it just kind of repeats certain things over and over again so that young kids can phonetically get used to saying those words, especially if they're common everyday objects. So with the first one, Stick Boy and Match Girl, Tim Burton does harken in on that kind of style of writing where it is repetitive, but you'll see the Tim Burton-ness in a second. So if you will indulge me. Stick Boy liked Match Girl. He liked her a lot. He liked her cute figure. He thought she was hot. But could a flame ever burn between a match and a stick? It did quite literally. He burnt up pretty quick. So you can see right away that this opening page is going to tell you everything you need to know about the other stories that are in this book. One of the poems that's in here, Stain Boy, I think actually ended up becoming like a little short that Burton did, sort of like Vincent and Frankenweenie. I'll go ahead and read one of my other ones too. It's a little bit longer, but a lot of these were sort of like the macabre ABCs. That's sort of like the general feeling of a lot of these. And, reading this as a kid, I just thought it was really funny, and I liked a lot of the illustrations that were in there. And looking at it as an adult now, I'm kind of surprised that some of these didn't freak me out as much. But I think a lot of that also has to do with the fact that I sort of grew up with Tim Burton movies. And I was used to that aesthetic, There wasn't a whole lot of his stuff that he's done that's made me legitimately terrified. I also would have been used to the kind of humor from Tim Burton, so I don't think a lot of the black humor in this, none of it was off-putting. just because that was the kind of thing that I thought was funny back then. I was a weird little kid. So I'm going to go ahead and read Roy the Toxic Boy. This is, again, one of my other favorites in here, just so that I can share with you these little treasures. I decided to do these kind of like little live readings with you this episode instead of what I normally do, in part because I think nursery rhymes and fairy tales tend to go hand in hand, even though they are quite different in their function. But also, I didn't want to talk about that Once Upon a Time episode by myself, just because there's been a lot of negativity going around recently. And instead of bitching and moaning about something, I wanted to share something that I enjoyed. So here is Roy the Toxic Boy. To those who knew him, his friends, we called him Roy. To others, he was known as that horrible toxic boy. He loved ammonia and asbestos and lots of cigarette smoke. What he breathed in for air would make other people choke. His very favorite toy was a can of aerosol spray. He'd sit quietly and shake it and spray it all day. He'd stand inside the garage in the early morning frost, waiting for the car to start and fill him with exhaust. The one and only time I ever saw Toxic Boy cry was when some sodium chloride got into his eye. One day, for fresh air, they put him in the garden. His face went deathly pale, and his body began to harden. The final gasp of his short life was sickly with despair. Who ever thought that you could die from breathing outdoor air? As Roy's soul left his body, we all said a silent prayer. It drifted up to heaven and left a hole in the ozone layer. So you got to admit, that's some pretty silly stuff. The little illustration for Roy is adorable too. I think most of why I like this book as a kid had to do with the illustrations. If you're used to the Tim Burton kind of sketches, not necessarily what manifests in the claymation or CGI, but just the actual sketches that he does, they're kind of gross and kind of cute and somewhere in between. But the one that I want to talk about the most is actually the title proper, The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy. So that title does not originate from Tim Burton. That was actually something that was written by somebody else, Michael McDowell. Novelist, screenwriter. He's worked with many different people. He's worked on many different movies, including Beetlejuice with Tim Burton. He also worked on Nightmare Before Christmas. He has worked with Stephen King before. The one I can think of off the top of my head is Thinner. He's written for TV, and he was one of the main screenwriters for Clue, which is awesome. And I think that really gets showcased in The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy. Not that it doesn't sound like Tim Burton, but Burton has a really good knack for tapping into what makes children's literature work and how to mirror that. And this definitely, although it is rhyming and is about a child and does sound very nursery rhymey in its prose, you can tell that this was written by somebody different. And I'm actually really glad that I found this out. That's most of the reason why I decided to talk about this instead of some other kind of literature I like, is because I found out that the main title of one of the best-known books by Tim Burton, the main title doesn't come from Tim Burton. I just thought that was interesting. So I am going to make sure that my voice doesn't give out while reading this, because it's probably the longest one in this collection. So let me take a swig of wine, and I will read you The Melancholy Death of Oyster Boy. He proposed in the dunes, they were wed by the sea. Their 9-day-long honeymoon was on the Isle of Capri. For their supper they had one spectacular dish, a simmering stew of mollusks and fish, and while he savored the broth, her bride's heart made a wish. That wish came true. She gave birth to a baby. But was this little one human? Well, maybe. 10 fingers, 10 toes, he had plumbing and sight. He could hear, he could feel, but normal? Not quite. This unnatural birth, this canker, this blight, was the start and the end and the sum of their plight. She railed at the doctor. He cannot be mine. He smells of the ocean of seaweed and brine. You should count yourself lucky, for only last week I treated a girl with 3 ears and a beak. That your son is half oyster, you cannot blame me. Have you ever considered, by chance, a small home by the sea? Not knowing what to name him, they just called him Sam, or sometimes that thing that looks like a clam. Everyone wondered, but no one could tell. When would young Oyster Boy come out of his shell? When the Thompson quadruplets espied him one day, they called him a bivalve and ran quickly away. One spring afternoon, Sam was left in the rain. At the southwestern corner of Seaview in Maine, he watched the rain water as it swirled down the drain. His mom on the freeway in the breakdown lane was pounding the dashboard she couldn't contain, the ever-rising grief, frustration, and pain. "Really, sweetheart," she said, "I don't mean to make fun, but something smells fishy, and I think it's our son. I don't like to say this, but it must be said. You're blaming our son for your problems in bed." He tried salves. He tried ointments that turned everything red. He tried potions and lotions and tincture of lead. He ached and he itched and he twitched and he bled. The doctor diagnosed, "I can't be quite sure, but the cause of the problem may also be the cure. They say oysters improve your sexual powers. Perhaps eating your son would help you do it for hours." He came on tiptoe. He came on the sly, sweat on his forehead, and on his lips a lie. "Son, are you happy? I don't mean to pry, but do you dream of heaven? Have you ever wanted to die?" Sam blinked his eye twice, but made no reply. Dad fingered his knife and loosened his tie. As he picked up his son, Sam dripped on his coat. With the shell to his lips, Sam slipped down his throat. They buried him quickly in the sand by the sea, sighed a prayer, wiped a tear, and they were back home by 3. A cross of gray driftwood marked Oyster Boy's grave. Words written sand promised Jesus would save. But his memory was lost with one high tide wave. So that is it. That is the melancholy death of Oyster Boy. And as a kid, I think just because of how long that poem was, and just because of the nature of that poem, that was probably the only one that bothered me. But as an adult, it doesn't bother me quite as much. I think just because of the absurdity of all of it. But if you can find this book, if you can rent it from your library, if you can find a copy of it online or anything like that, I do highly recommend reading it if you're the kind of fan of perverse fairy tales and nursery rhymes. This is sort of like the more adult version of the Stinky Cheese Man book that came out. I don't know, one of these days I might review that one too at some point and read a little bit of that. But I gotta level with you folks. I really haven't been doing that well this week on a mental basis, and I've been really bombarded with work recently. So I've been rereading books that have some sort of impact on me from when I was a kid or when I was a teenager, and I thought about this book, and it just sort of given me the break I needed after a very long week and after a very trying week. So I hope that you were able to enjoy me reading these dark and dreary poems to you. They sort of shined a bizarro light in my day, and I hope they shined one on yours too. Next week, Amanda will be back. Once Upon a Time will be back. We can get to talk about Robert Carlyle again and Lana Parrilla, and why doing an adaptation of a real life person for a kid's movie isn't that bad. But to say that that story isn't true is kind of insulting to the memory of people who actually died. So compared to my thoughts in next week's episodes, the melancholy death of Oyster Boy was a walk in the park. So until next time, just remember, it may not be the end, it may not be happy, but you are always welcome to this party. Take care.